Vanessa Whitcomb looked me up and down and then laughed out loud in front of the whole homeowners association. "You think a man like you could own this entire lake?" The room went quiet. I didn't argue with her. I just set my father's deed on the table and asked her one question. "Then who gave your association permission to build 38 docks on my land?" Vanessa kept smiling right through the weekend. She was still smiling Monday morning when the sheriff's vehicles rolled slowly along the shoreline and a deputy stepped out and began taping closure orders onto every single dock the association had ever called their own. If you enjoy stories where an arrogant board looks down on a man and then walks straight into its own legal trap, subscribe now so the reversal doesn't pass you by. My father died in the spring, and by the middle of June I was back at the lake with a truck bed full of cedar planks and a bad shoulder that reminded me every morning that I was 52 years old. Calvin Bellamy had been gone 11 weeks, and the boathouse he built on the western shore had been sitting untouched for closer to 5 years than 3. Green water stains climbed the pilings. 2 of the roof joists had gone soft where the flashing failed. I parked in the grass, opened the doors, and let the smell of old varnish and lake air come out at me the way it had when I was 9 years old and he was teaching me to seat a bolt without stripping the wood. I had come back to fix a building. That was the whole plan. Fix the building, sit in his chair, decide later what to do with the rest. What I hadn't planned for was how completely the far side of the water had changed. When I was a boy, the eastern shore held 11 houses, a gravel road, and a stand of La Bali pile enough to hide a heron. Now there were mansions with stone chimneys and iron gates, a paved lane with decorative street lamps, a clubhouse with striped awnings, and docks. Docks everywhere. They ran out from the bank in neat little fingers, one after another, some with boat lifts, some with covered slips, some with those aluminum roofs that catch the light and throw it back too hard. Briarstone Shores had grown up while my father was growing old, and it had grown down onto the surface of the water in a way I had never seen described in any letter he sent me. I worked for 4 days without seeing anybody except a woman in a kayak who waved at me the way people wave at gardeners. On the 5th day, a white sport utility vehicle came down the access lane, stopped at the top of the grade, and sat there with the engine running for long enough that I set down my drill and turned around. The woman who got out was somewhere in her 40s, wearing linen and sunglasses that cost more than my chop saw, and she came down the slope with the walk of somebody who has never once wondered whether she belongs where she's standing. "Excuse me," she said, "where's your contractor?" I told her I didn't have one. She looked past me at the boathouse, at the plank stack, at the extension cord running up to the pole. "Then who authorized this work? There's supposed to be a submittal for anything on the waterline. Are you licensed? Do you have a permit to be in this area?" I wiped my hands on my thigh and I gave her the truth plainly, because in those days I still assumed the truth would settle things. "I don't think I need permission from a homeowners association to stand on my own land." That's when she laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not yet. It was worse than cruel. It was the laugh you give a child who has told you he owns the moon, warm and utterly certain, and she put her hand flat against her collarbone while she did it. Then she took her sunglasses off, folded them, and delivered the sentence that turned my summer into something else entirely. "Sir, the lake belongs to the association." I didn't answer her. I stood there and let the words sit in the air between us, and I felt something in my chest go very cold and very quiet, the way it does when a gauge reads a number that shouldn't be possible. Behind her the water lay flat and brown gold in the late light, and out on it 30 or 40 yards apart, the docks reached out from the eastern bank like fingers on a hand that had decided the whole thing already belonged to it. She came back 2 days later, and this time she brought company. A tall man in boat shoes introduced himself as the treasurer, and a younger woman with a clipboard said nothing at all for the entire 20 minutes. The one in linen finally gave me her name, Vanessa Whitcomb, president of the Briarstone Shores Homeowners Association, and she said it the way other people say a rank. She had come with a list, and she read from it standing on my father's grass. I was to stop all construction on the boathouse immediately, pending architectural review. I was to remove the small aluminum skiff I'd been using to check the pilings from the surface of the lake within 48 hours, and I was to submit an application for what she called an association lake access permit, along with a $200 processing fee and proof of liability coverage naming the association as an additional insured party. I asked her a simple question: when did the association buy the lake? She didn't answer it. I want to be precise about that because it mattered later, and because at the time I thought she was being evasive out of habit rather than fear. She talked instead about property values, about the $4.2 million sale on the North Point in March, about how carefully the community had protected its character over 3 decades. She talked about the clubhouse and the water quality committee. She said the phrase "our lake" 3 separate times in about 90 seconds, and then she said the thing that people always say when they've decided you're not real. The people who live here are the actual owners of this place. I told her that people who live somewhere and people who own something aren't always the same set, and that the difference is usually written down at the county courthouse. The treasurer laughed under his breath, and Vanessa Whitcomb looked over my shoulder at my truck, a 1998 3/4 ton with a cracked bumper and one mismatched fender, and then she looked at my boots, and then she looked at my hands, and she said it. People like you generally work around places like this. You don't own them. She never said one word about my skin. She didn't have to. It was in the pause before "like you," and in the little downward flick of her eyes, and in the way she said "places like this," as though the water and the pines and the light had all been manufactured in a factory that only shipped to certain zip codes. I have been black in America for 52 years, and I have a very reliable ear for that particular octave. My father had the same ear. He used to say that the insult isn't the sentence, it's the confidence underneath the sentence. Has the name Bellamy ever come up in your association's records? She had no idea. It was written all over her face, and for 1/2 second something flickered there that looked almost like caution. Then she closed it down, snapped her folder shut, and told me I had 48 hours to vacate the area and remove my equipment before the association pursued enforcement. The 3 of them walked back up the grade to the vehicle, and the younger woman with the clipboard glanced back at me once and then looked away fast. That night I did something I had been putting off since the funeral. I went into the back bedroom of my father's house, moved a stack of hymnals off the top of a gray steel document safe, and worked the combination that was my mother's birthday. Inside were tax receipts going back to the Reagan years, 3 folded flags, an envelope of photographs, a bundle of correspondence tied with kitchen twine, and at the very bottom, flat and yellowed and folded into eighths, a survey plat dated 1987. I spread it out on the kitchen table under the overhead light, and I felt the hair rise on my arms. A red line ran around nearly the entire body of water, not along the shore but out and around it, enclosing the bed of the lake itself, and along the western side it swung inland to take in a long ribbon of bank. Beside that line, in draftsman's lettering, somebody had written 4 words and a number: Bellamy Parcel 17. Vanessa Whitcomb was not the kind of woman who let a deadline pass unmarked. Over the following 9 days, my mailbox and my inbox filled up like a storm drain. First came a formal warning letter on association letterhead citing unauthorized shoreline construction, then a notice of violation, then a second notice of violation with a daily accrual of $50, then an invoice for unpaid lake usage fees calculated retroactively over 18 months, which was interesting since I had been living 400 miles away for most of that period. Then a demand that I register my skiff with the association's watercraft program, including hull identification and a decal fee. Then a final notice advising me that unregistered vessels and equipment could be removed from the area at the owner's expense. She also sent a community-wide message. I only saw it because a woman named Ruth Delaney, who had known my mother, printed it out and slid it under my door with a note that said, "Thought you should have this, honey." The message informed all residents that an unauthorized individual had been observed conducting unpermitted work along the western shore and was making unfounded claims of ownership over the lake, that the board was consulting counsel, and that residents should not engage with him directly. An unauthorized individual. On the parcel my grandfather bought in 1952 with money he earned pouring concrete for a state highway that would not have served a hotel he was allowed to sleep in. My father had spent 30 years turning down developers who wanted to dredge that lakebed, and now I had been converted, in one sentence, into a trespasser standing on my own family's ground. Here is the part that I think matters most about that stretch of days. I did not answer to any of it with anger. I answered it with a camera. Every morning at first light I put on waders and walked the shoreline, and every afternoon out a notebook. I photographed each dock from the water and from the bank. I photographed the permit numbers stenciled on the pilings, the placards bolted to the handrails, the concrete anchors, the pile caps, the electrical runs, and the little brass plates screwed onto the newer decking with installation dates. I photographed association signage, the boat launch, the roped swim area, the fee schedule posted at the clubhouse, and the sales flyer in the window of the real estate office at the crossroads. There were 38 docks. I counted them 4 times on 4 different days, in 3 cases waiting out to confirm that 2 structures were separate rather than joined. 9 of them were less than 3 years old. I could tell by the lumber, by the galvanizing, by the fact that the concrete under 6 of them still had form marks that hadn't weathered smooth, and every single one of the 38 carried the same placard in white letters on green aluminum. Briarstone Association offered dock. So I called Elliot Crane. He was a real estate attorney in the county seat, 58 years old, dry as a cracker, and my father had used him for something small a decade back. I told him the whole thing over the phone in about 11 minutes, the laugh, the fees, the notices, the message about the unauthorized individual, the 38 docks with their green signs. He let me finish without interrupting once, which I appreciated more than any sympathy he could have offered. Then he asked, "Darius, do you have a deed?" I told him I had the deed, the plat, the tax records going back to 1954, and a survey with a red line around the whole lakebed. "Is there an easement?" I said I didn't know. There was a pause, and then he said something that I have repeated to myself many times since. "Then we don't yet know which of you is in trouble." 2 days later, at 7 minutes after 8 in the morning, he called me back. He had spent both of those days in the county records office and the clerk's archive, and when he spoke, his voice had a different texture in it, tighter and considerably more interested. "Darius," he said, "listen to me carefully. Do not sign one single thing that woman puts in front of you." I drove into town that afternoon, and Elliot laid the history of Lake Briarstone out on his conference table in 6 neat stacks, and he walked me through it in the order the county had recorded it, because he said the order was the whole story. The lake was not natural. It was impounded in 1951 when a small earthen dam went in across Briar Creek, and the land under the water, along with the dam, was assembled by my grandfather Josiah Bellamy over the following 3 years in 5 separate purchases. That assembly recorded as one parcel, 17B, and it consisted of the lakebed, the dam and spillway, a strip of the western bank 120 feet deep, and what the instrument called the exclusive right to authorize fixed improvements founded upon the described bed. That last clause was the one Elliot circled twice with a red pencil. Whoever owns the bed of a private lake controls what gets driven into it. A dock is not a boat. A dock is a permanent structure founded on the bottom. Then Elliot moved to the second stack, and this was where it got interesting. In 1994, my father entered into an agreement with Briarstone Development Group, the outfit that was building the first phase on the eastern shore. I had never heard of the document. It was 11 pages long, and my father's signature was on page 10 in the same careful hand he used on birthday cards. It was not a sale, it was not an easement, it was a license. Elliot explained the difference to me the way you'd explain it to a jury, and I have used his explanation on about 40 people since. An easement is an interest in land. It attaches to the land itself. It runs with it. It survives the death of everybody who signed it, and it shows up in the title work forever. A license is permission. Personal, it is revocable. It lasts as long as its terms say it lasts, and when the party who received it ceases to exist, the permission ceases with it. An easement is a road. A license is somebody handing you a key and telling you they'd like it back. The 1994 license let Briarstone Development Group construct up to 14 private docks at locations approved in writing by Calvin Bellamy, maintain a boat launch, and permit residents of the platted subdivision to use the water surface for non-motorized recreation and motors under 10 horsepower. In exchange, the developer maintained the shoreline, carried insurance covering the lake, and paid my father $4,000 a year, adjusted, and I found those checks later in a folder marked simply Lake. The license ran for a term of 20 years. And it contained 2 sentences that Elliot read out loud twice. The rights granted were expressly non-assignable and non-transferable without the prior written consent of the owner of parcel 17B, and the license terminated automatically upon dissolution of the licensee or upon expiration of the term, whichever occurred first, with no right of renewal absent a new written instrument. Briarstone Development Group dissolved in 2006. I sat in that conference room and looked at the certificate of dissolution, a single page of state paperwork, and understood that the association across the water had been operating for 20 years on permission that had died with a company most of the current residents had never heard of. There was no new written instrument. Elliot had searched the grantor and grantee indexes, the miscellaneous book, the plat files, and the association's own recorded declarations and amendments. The lake appeared in the association's marketing constantly. It appeared in its recorded common property schedule not once. "How long have they been acting like owners?" I asked him. He squared the stack with both hands before he answered. "At least 6 years, aggressively. They've been collecting a lake access assessment from every household. They've been issuing what they call dock permits for a fee with a renewal cycle. They've built docks, and they've been advertising the homes with the phrase association-controlled private lake, which is in the listing sheet you photographed." Then he pulled one more page out from under everything else, and this was the one that changed the shape of the fight. 2 days earlier, a courier had delivered a document to my door with a note from Vanessa Whitcomb saying she wanted to resolve matters amicably and that this was a routine formality. It was 3 pages printed on association letterhead titled Lake Maintenance Acknowledgement. I had brought it in unsigned because Elliot had told me to. He read it once fast, and then his whole posture changed. He set it down, took his glasses off, and looked at me across the table for a good 5 seconds. "Do you understand what this is?" I told him it looked like a maintenance form. It talked about joint stewardship of the water body, about the association's ongoing responsibility for shoreline upkeep, about cooperative access. It read like something a committee wrote to feel useful. "It's a recital," Elliot said. "Buried in paragraph 2, it has you acknowledging the association's established and continuing right of use and management of the lake, and in paragraph 3 it has you agreeing not to contest structures existing as of this date. If you sign this, you have arguably ratified 20 years of trespass and consented to 38 docks in writing. It is worth several $1,000,000 to them, and it costs you your entire position." And she sent it to you unrepresented with a note calling it routine. I looked at that piece of paper for a long moment. "So she knows they have a problem," I said. Elliot picked up his glasses again. "I'd say she found out very recently, and I'd say she'd rather solve it with your signature than with a lawyer's." I went. Elliot came with me in a gray suit, carrying a leather portfolio, and I wore a pressed shirt and my father's watch, and we sat in the 4th row of folding chairs, while the room filled with something like 140 people. There were kids on the floor by the windows. There was a folding table with lemonade. Vanessa sat at the head table under the projection screen with the treasurer on one side and the board secretary on the other, and she had arranged the whole thing to feel like a hearing rather than a meeting, which it was not, and which she did not have the authority to conduct. She opened by introducing me, and she did it standing up. "Many of you have heard about our situation on the western shore. This is the gentleman who is currently claiming that he personally owns Lake Briarstone." The room laughed. Not everyone, and not for long, but enough of it landed that I could feel the temperature of the crowd. Somebody in the back said something I didn't catch and got a snort out of his neighbor. Vanessa let it run for exactly the right length of time, and then she raised a hand for quiet like a woman conducting an orchestra she owned. For the next 20 minutes she told a story about a community under threat. She said an outside party was attempting to seize control of a community amenity that generations of families had built and maintained. She said the board had been advised that such claims often collapse under scrutiny, but that they must be taken seriously because of the potential impact on values. She used the phrase "our lake" more times than I bothered counting. She showed a slide of the clubhouse. She showed a slide of children on the swim dock. She never once showed a document. Then she turned to me directly, with the room behind her, and she asked the question she had clearly been building toward all evening. "Do you honestly expect everyone in this room to believe that you own this lake?" "No," I said. She smiled. It was a real smile, satisfied, and she started to turn back to the room. "I expect the county records to prove it," I said. "You don't have to believe me. Nobody has to believe me. That's the useful thing about recorded instruments." Elliot stood up, asked the chair for 2 minutes, and did not wait to be granted them. He walked to the front, and he laid 3 things on the table in front of Vanessa Whitcomb one at a time, and he named each one for the room as he said in deed recording parcel 17B, including the bed of the lake, the dam, and the exclusive right to authorize fixed improvements founded upon that bed in the name of Calvin Bellamy and now his estate, the 1987 survey plat showing the boundary of that parcel in relation to the platted lots of Briarstone Shores, and the 1994 license agreement between Calvin Bellamy and Briarstone Development Group, non-assignable 20-year term terminating automatically upon dissolution of the licensee. Vanessa did not fold. I will give her that much. She said the association had succeeded to the developer's rights upon transition of control, that this was standard, that the developer had turned over the amenities to the association in 2001 along with the clubhouse and the roads. Elliot asked her to produce the instrument. She said the transition documents were extensive. He asked her to produce the instrument that assigned the lake license specifically with the written consent of the owner of parcel 17B as required by paragraph 9. She said she would have counsel review it. He said that was not an answer, and that he had already reviewed everything the association had recorded, and there was no such instrument in the county's records, and if one existed outside them, he would be delighted to see it that evening. She had nothing. She looked at the treasurer, and the treasurer looked at the table. I stood up then because there was one question that belonged to me rather than to my lawyer. Who authorized 38 docks? The board authorized them, Vanessa said, through the proper permitting process. Which lakebed does the board own? The silence in that clubhouse went on long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone in it. Somewhere a folding chair creaked. Vanessa Whitcomb's color came up in 2 patches high on her cheeks, and then she did the thing that people do when the ground moves. She got loud. She said this was exactly the kind of opportunistic harassment the board had warned about, that the association would be filing suit, that I would be hearing from their attorneys, and that I should be prepared for a very long and very expensive process. "Go ahead," I said, and sat back down. That would have been the end of the evening. It wasn't, because at the back of the room, near the lemonade table, an older man in a windbreaker got to his feet and waited to be noticed. He was well past 70, tall, stooped, with the forearms of somebody who had spent his life outdoors. "Harold Vance," he said. "I've lived on Cardinal Court since '98. Before that, I was a project engineer for the developer for 11 years. He looked at Vanessa, not at me. The lake was never ours to give away, and it was never the association's to take. That agreement couldn't be handed to anybody. We knew it in '94. I'd like to know who forgot." Harold Vance came to Elliott's office on the Thursday with 2 banker's boxes in the trunk of a Buick, and he apologized for the dust, and then he proceeded to hand us the last pieces of the thing. The council memorandum was 2 pages, and it was devastating in the calm way that lawyers are devastating when they are writing for their own files. It advised the developer's principles of 4 points. The lake was owned in fee by Calvin Bellamy, including the bed. The company held a limited personal revocable license to use the surface and to construct a capped number of docks at approved locations. The license could not be assigned, pledged, or transferred to the Homeowners Association or to any successor entity without Bellamy's written consent, and any attempt to do so would be void. And upon dissolution of the company, all rights under the license would terminate, leaving any structures on the bed subject to the owner's authority. So here is what the paper actually established, and I want to be careful because I have never wanted to overstate it. 14 docks, built between 1995 and 2004 at approved locations, were almost certainly lawful when they were built. What happened to their status after 2006 was a genuine legal question. The other 24 were not a genuine legal question. 24 docks had been built by the association on my family's lakebed after the permission to build there had ceased to exist, with no consent from any owner of parcel 17B, and 9 of those in the last 3 years. And then Elliott found the detail that made my stomach turn over, because it moved the matter from institutional carelessness to something with a person's name on it. Going through the dock permit files the association had produced in response to a records demand, he pulled out the permits themselves. Each one bore a signature block, and on 19 of them, in a firm looping hand above a typed line, was the signature of Vanessa Whitcomb, and the typed line read, "Authorized Lake Owner Representative." She had signed 19 times over 4 years as the representative of the owner of a lake the association did not own, on documents for which residents paid between $400 and $1,200 each. I did not want to burn down that neighborhood. I need to say this plainly because it would have been easy, and because a version of me that had been laughed at in a clubhouse wanted to. 206 households were sitting on top of this. Most of them had bought their homes from a listing sheet that promised an association-controlled private lake, and most of them had paid their assessments and taught their children to swim off structures that a board had told them were properly permitted. They were not the ones who had looked at my truck and decided what I could and couldn't own. So Elliott sent a letter, and the letter was almost boring. It asked for 4 things: suspend the issuance and renewal of any dock or lake permits immediately, halt all construction on or over the lake bed, provide written acknowledgement of the ownership of parcel 17B as recorded, and sit down within 30 days to negotiate a new recorded lake use agreement that would allow existing compliant structures to remain on lawful terms. He offered to meet at their office with their counsel at their convenience. He put no dollar figure in it at all. Vanessa refused. Her response, through a lawyer who I later learned had been retained without a board vote, denied everything, asserted rights by prescription and by implication and by 3 other theories, and characterized our letter as an attempt to extort a settlement from a residential community. Then she sent another message to every household. This one said that the individual on the Western Shore was attempting to hold the entire community financially hostage, that he was demanding money for the use of amenities residents had already paid for, and that the board would defend them. My name was in it this time. 2 people stopped speaking to Ruth Delaney for bringing me a pie. And then, 8 days later, on a Tuesday morning, I heard a diesel engine and a hydraulic whine across the water, and I took my binoculars out onto the dock. There was a barge on my lake with a pile driver on it. A contractor crew was setting up between lots 41 and 42, and they were beginning work on the 39th dock. I watched them drive the first pile. I watched the hammer come down and the timber go into the bed of a lake my grandfather bought with concrete money. 11 days after their association had received a certified letter putting them on formal written notice of the ownership of that bed and demanding that construction stop. I stood there with the binoculars until my arms got tired, and then I went inside and called Elliot and described it, and I asked him what we did now. He was quiet for maybe 3 seconds. "Now we stop sending letters," he said. The next morning at 9:40, Elliot Crane filed a verified complaint in the Circuit Court of the county with an application for a temporary injunction, and he attached 41 exhibits. Vanessa Whitcomb thought I was bluffing right up to the end. I know this because that Saturday, 2 days after the filing and 1 day after the association was served, the board held its annual summer social on the water. There were pontoon boats rafted up off the swim dock and a rented sound system on the clubhouse lawn, and I could hear the bass line from my father's porch until nearly 10 at night. Somebody set off fireworks over the middle of the lake, over my lake, with a court date pending, while their own contractor's barge sat tied to a piling 300 yards away. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in a courtroom with bad air conditioning and 11 people in the gallery, 4 of them from Briarstone Shores. Their lawyer argued for 35 minutes, and to be fair to him, he had been handed an impossible file 9 days earlier. He argued that the association had used the lake openly for decades, that the residents had relied on that use, the equity favored the status quo, and that the balance of harm ran against closing amenities in the middle of summer. Elliot took 20 minutes, and he did not raise his voice once. He put in the deed, he put in the survey, he put in the license and the dissolution certificate and the developer council memorandum from Harold Vance's garage in the absence of any recorded assignment. He put in the certified letter and the signed receipt for it. He put in my photographs, date stamped, of a pile driver working 11 days after that receipt. He put in the 19 permits signed by Vanessa Whitcomb as authorized lake owner representative. And he made one argument about harm that I had not anticipated, and it turned out to be the one that mattered most to the judge. If the association did not own or control the lake bed, then the association was not the party insuring these structures against the bed's owner. And 38 docks in a swim area were being used by hundreds of people, including children, under a chain of authority that did not exist. Nobody was inspecting them under any authority. Nobody's coverage plainly reached them. My client, Elliot said, is the party who would be sued if a piling failed under a family on the 4th of July, and he has no legal ability to inspect or condition structures that were installed without his consent. The judge did not resolve who owned what. She was careful, and she said so twice. Final determination of Talsenate the status of the original 14 structures, and any claim for unjust enrichment would all be tried in due course. But she found the recorded ownership of Parcel 17 clear on its face, the license plainly expired, the assignment absent, and the ongoing construction a deliberate act after notice, and she signed a temporary order. All construction on or over the lakebed of Lake Briarstone was to cease immediately. The association was enjoined from issuing, renewing, selling, or enforcing any permit, license, or authorization for use of the lake or its bed. All docks and fixed structures on the lakebed constructed or authorized by the association were to be closed to use, pending inspection and a determination of their legal status. Notice was to be posted at each structure, and enforcement was assigned to the office of the county sheriff. They came on Monday morning. I hadn't known the day, and I hadn't asked. I was on the western shore with a caulking gun when I saw the first vehicle come down the paved lane, and then a second, and then a county truck with a magnetic decal on the door. 4 of them altogether. They parked in a line along the shoreline drive, and men got out with clipboards and a roll of orange tape and a stack of laminated placards, and they started at the north end and worked south. The deputy in charge was a man named Nolan Pierce, and his manner is the reason the whole morning felt the way it did. He was not enjoying himself, and he was not apologizing, and he moved down a list of 38 structures at the pace of a man reading a gas meter. Dock number 1 on the north point in front of the $4.2 million house. 2 zip ties on the gate, orange tape across the walkway, a placard at eye level, closed by order of the Kirk Court. Dock number 2, closed. By dock number 9 there were people on the drive. By 14 there was a crowd of 30. They took the covered slips, they took the boat lifts, they took the swim dock with the ladder where the children jumped, they took the pontoon at 22, and the 2 new ones at 29 and 30 where the concrete still had form marks. At 36 a man tried to argue, and Pierce told him, without any heat at all, that he was welcome to take it up with the court, and that he could not remove the tape. 37-38. And then the barge and the half-built 39th, which got its own separate notice. Vanessa Whitcomb arrived somewhere around dock number 16. I watched her come down the drive at a run in flat shoes, phone in one hand, and she got in front of Deputy Pierce and put her palm up. "You need to stop. Stop right now. Who authorized this? These are private amenities. You cannot close these." Pierce asked for her name. "Vanessa Whitcomb. I'm the president of this association. I manage this lake." He looked down at the order on his clipboard. He turned it a quarter turn, the way you do when you're checking a name against a name. "Not according to this document, ma'am." She said something else, and he was already walking to dock 17. She followed him for 2 more docks, talking, and then she stopped following. I was standing on my own shore 400 yards away across flat water, and I could see her clearly. A woman in linen standing in the middle of a paved lane with a telephone in her hand, watching a man in a tan uniform tape shut the last of the 38 docks she had told me, in that voice, belonged to her. She had asked me how a man like me could possibly own a lake. She got her answer on a Monday morning in July, and it was written on a laminated placard, and there were 38 of them. The anger came at me first. That surprised me for about a day, and then it stopped surprising me, because they had only ever heard one version, and it had been delivered by their own president on official letterhead. Ruth Delaney's front window got egged. My mailbox post got knocked sideways by somebody's bumper. A man in a golf shirt drove down my access lane and yelled that I'd closed the lake on his grandkids' vacation week, and I let him finish, and he sat in his truck, breathing hard for a minute afterward, and then said quieter, "Is any of what she said true?" That was the question that gave me my opening. So I did the thing Vanessa had done, except backward. I rented the fellowship hall at the church out on the county road, and I put a plain notice in every mailbox in Briarstone Shores inviting any resident to come hear the documents with their own counsel if they wanted, and I paid for coffee and donuts out of my own pocket. About 90 people came. Harold Vance came, Elliot came, and he brought copies, 150 sets, stapled. And then I said the only thing I had really come to say. "I didn't close your docks. The court closed them, because your association could not produce any document showing it ever had the right to build them. I want them open. I'm the one who has to look at them out my window." Then a woman near the front, a pediatric nurse named Claire Hobbs, asked the question I had not planned for and could not have asked as effectively as she did. "When did Vanessa find out about this?" The board secretary was in the 3rd row. Her name was Meredith Alderman, and she had been the woman with the clipboard on my father's grass. And she had said nothing that day, and very little since. She had a laptop with her. She said she could look at the board account because officers' correspondence on association business was in a common archive, and she opened it right there while 100 people waited. It took her about 4 minutes. There was a message from a title company dated the previous October, 8 months before Vanessa Whitcomb ever laid eyes on me. A closing on Lot 83 had turned up a problem in the examiner's report. The lake and its bed were not within the association's common property and appeared to be held in fee by a third party, with no recorded easement or assignment benefiting the association. The examiner recommended that the association obtain counsel and address it before further waterfront representations were made. The message was addressed to Vanessa Whitcomb as president. There was a read receipt. What there was in the sent folder was a message from Vanessa to a paralegal at a firm in the city, dated 11 days after the title company's warning, asking whether a short acknowledgement signed by a private owner could establish the association's continuing right to use and manage a water body where the original grant had lapsed and what language would be most effective. Attached was a draft. The draft was titled Lake Maintenance Acknowledgement. She had known for 8 months. She had known before she came down my grade and asked me where my contractor was. She had known when she laughed. She had known when she told me that people like me work around places like this edge rather than own them. And she had known when she wrote to 206 households calling me an unauthorized individual, and every one of those things had been said by a woman who already had the answer in her inbox and had decided that the cheapest way out of it was my signature. The room went for her and she was in it. She had come at the back, and I did not see her until people started turning. A board member named Doug Prentice stood up and asked her straight out, "Did you know we didn't own the lake?" Vanessa Whitcomb stood in a church fellowship hall, with 90 of her neighbors looking at her and said, "It isn't that simple." "Actually," I said, "you're the one who made it complicated. It was simple last October. All you had to do was tell them and call me." She left before the vote. The board met in open session the following week and did 3 things. Opened an internal review of the president's conduct, suspended her authority to execute any document on behalf of the association, and voted to authorize counsel to negotiate with me rather than litigate against me. And that left me holding the only real decision anybody had left to make. 38 docks closed taped on my family's lakebed. Nobody in the county could open them but me. So I didn't give it to her. What Elliot and I put on the table was a recorded lake use agreement with a 30-year term. Any existing dock that passed a structural inspection by a licensed engineer at the homeowner's cost could remain exactly where it was permanently, and the right would run with the property rather than depending on anybody's goodwill. Docks that failed inspection had 18 months to be repaired to standard or removed, and I agreed in writing to approve any repair that met the standard. New structures required my written consent at an approved location, which is what my father had required for 30 years and what the license had required before that. The fee was $240 a year per waterfront lot, less than the association had been charging for its own permits, and it was not a fee for the privilege of my permission. It went into a segregated account with an annual statement mailed to every household, and it paid for exactly 4 things. Engineering inspection of the dam and spillway on the 5-year cycle my father had always kept, shoreline stabilization, a liability policy naming both me and the association, and water quality testing 4 times a year through the county extension office. Non-waterfront households paid nothing and kept full use of the launch and the swim area. I paid the same rate on my own 2 structures. Nobody lost a home. Nobody lost the water. Nobody's kid lost the swim dock. The only thing that disappeared from Lake Briarstone was an authority that had never legally existed in the first place, and the woman who had invented it. The board approved the framework by a vote of 6-1. The engineers started at the north end in September and worked south, and the docks came out of the tape one at a time as the paperwork cleared, which felt like a kind of answer to the Monday I had watched from my shore. 31 passed outright, 5 needed work, and 4 of those 5 were done by Thanksgiving. 2 came out, both of them from the last 3 years. Both of them built after the notice, and neither owner blamed me because by then they had read the permits they had paid for. The membership removed Vanessa Whitcomb from the presidency at the annual meeting in October. It wasn't close. The internal review found that she had failed to disclose a known material defect in the association's property rights for 8 months, retained counsel without authorization, and executed 19 instruments as authorized lake owner representative without any basis for the title. She stopped by the head table on her way out of that meeting, and she looked at me for a moment before she spoke. "You could have just told me at the beginning." "I did tell you," I said. "You just couldn't believe a man like me would be telling the truth." A few months later, Lake Briarstone was quiet again in the way it had been quiet when I was a boy. No sheriff's vehicles on the shoreline drive, no orange tape, no certified letters in my box on Saturday mornings, and no messages describing me to my neighbors as an individual. I finished my father's boathouse in the 2nd week of March on a cold, clear morning with a skin of ice along the reeds. New joists, new flashing, new decking in cedar because he would have wanted cedar even though he'd have complained about the price. The chair he used to sit in is still inside, facing the double doors that open west, and it still has the worn spot on the right arm where his hand went. I hung a photograph of him on the wall above it, 1980-something, standing on the dam in a canvas jacket with a clipboard squinting. Property's only worth something if you've got the character to defend your rights without turning into the thing you're defending them from. The association put up a new sign that sprang at the head of the launch, and they asked me to look at the wording first, which I took as the closest thing to an apology an institution is capable of producing. The old one had said HOA private lake, members only in white on green, and it had been there so long the bolts had rusted into the posts. The new one is cedar with routed letters, and it says, Lake Briarstone, access by agreement. One afternoon in April, I was carrying a bucket up from the water, and a silver sedan came along the shoreline drive on the far side slow, and I knew it before I could see the driver. Vanessa Whitcomb still lives on Heron Bend. She sold her boat. I set the bucket down on my father's new decking and looked out at all that flat water with 36 open docks reaching into it, and here's where I've landed. Vanessa once asked me how a black man like me could possibly own an entire lake. In the end, that was never the interesting question. The interesting question is why she ever thought she had the right to take it from me.